Hi, and welcome back to the podcast Storytelling, Story Listening. I'm your host, Jessica Hum, and this is the fourth episode where I sit down remotely during a time of COVID self-isolation and physical distancing. I sit down over the internet with a conversation with doctors Melanie Zurba and Sherry Pictou. These two have been my teachers throughout this podcast, and here I let them introduce themselves.
Sure. So, like you said, my name is Melanie Zurba, and there's a lot of ways to kind of express who you are. So maybe I'll just start with, the usual formality of the position that I have and how I came to know Jessica is as a prof at Dalhousie at the School for Resource Environmental Studies. I also have a joint appointment with the College of Sustainability and have been at those institutions for almost 2 years now. But I'm originally from Treaty 1 territory. That's the land that raised me and sustained me for most of my life. And I have great appreciation for the land and the people and communities that I've worked with there. I am, I guess I would call myself a settler Canadian. I'm second generation on one side and first generation on the other. Ukrainian and English mixed heritage, but recently have been discovering more about my roots. And so it's just an interesting process to be involved in this podcast type of activity about decolonization, because it's very helpful for thinking about identities and how that continuously evolves. So thanks, Jessica.
All right, thanks. And Dr. Sherry Pictou.
Hey, sure. My name is Sherry Pictou, and I'm a Mi'kmaq woman here from the land of Mi'kma'ki in a traditional district called Gespuit, which means the end of the flow, or otherwise known, it's sort of equivalent to the Southwestern Nova Scotia. And I'm currently a professor at Mount Saint Vincent University, but making the transition to a joint appointment in law and management at Dalhousie University. And I was thinking as Melanie was talking how, everything interweaves, because I met Jessica through Karen Beasley, I think made the suggestion, who sat on my PhD committee. I also knew Melanie, who had me into her class, and also Melanie and I did a couple of joint presentations, if you will, for the College of Sustainability. And then, so I've worked with each of you in different capacities, and then we all came together on this to do this particular project. And I don't know if we can imagine if this project would have been any different without the current situation of the COVID. However, to me, the decolonizing part about it all, it's creating space. This is virtual space, but it's creating space for those voices that ordinarily we might not hear. And it's just really fantastic in that way. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there's so much appreciation all around. And I just want to also say that I'm so appreciative of the both of you. This moment where we're here right now, amongst all the current affairs that are happening, it's a culmination of 4 months of us working very closely together on this project that we started envisioning back in December. Through my taking a class of Melanie's, you brought Sherry in as a guest speaker, and that's how, we started forming a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and it was also, true to Karen Baisley's credit, her suggestion that I explore a directed study that maybe used media like podcast as an outcome of academic study. And who better to start exploring these items, this exploration, this path of media as a gift, as a boundary object, as an outcome that we can give back into communities that we work with, than the two of you, because I know that those are very separately, but also, possibly here we are jointly working on one of those as boundary object, as media, as recorded storytelling. So yeah, so here we are. And I mean, along that same vein, I wanted to really approach you at the culmination after having recorded and shared with you the 3 podcasts that we've completed so far, that I recorded the stories of John Bizo from the Pictou Nation, Janet Rabiska, as well of the Pictou Nation living in the South and studying in the South, and most recently with Dr. Albert Marshall, also from, well, not from the Pictou Nation, but from Eskasoni, Mi'kmaq from Unama'ki. And all 3 of those had very similar themes. And we've been thinking, I've asked you about some reflections. And so I'll ask you on the podcast, you know, this is sort of, we started out with an idea that decolonizing methodologies are possible to incorporate into academic research, because I know that you both have done this, and it's been a central part of your careers and your work. So I'm wondering if, and maybe we could start with Sherry and then go back to Melanie, and we can go vice versa again. But if you would be able to comment on through this process, through the last few months, your reflections on this proposition that decolonizing methodologies are possible to incorporate into academic research.
Yeah. Well, just over the process, I have a lot to say about the podcasts themselves, but in contemplating this, and then as you were sharing your podcast of these wonderful narratives from these 3 extraordinary people with us, I was thinking to myself, it'd be interesting to get Melanie's thoughts on this as well, how interesting this is, because, well, there's just so many layers. We could talk about how those stories, you know, emerged from the people themselves that were on the podcast, but as a course itself. And I was thinking about one of those themes of like resilience and learning to let go or to go with the flow. As an instructor, we're trained that you put a syllabus together and this is what you're going to teach per lesson. And we sort of framed that, yet we left open a whole unknown aspect of this, that we did not know how this was going to turn out. And it's like doing research itself, right? And so for me as a co-instructor on this particular independent study, sort of, so to speak, you just had to let it go. And I was just thinking, it was there's so many overlapping themes. There's like the content of the podcast, like there's the content, there's the message, and there's the medium, and then there was a process for bringing that all about. And so I think, oh, I got to turn off my phone here. Sorry about that. So I think that was a big takeaway. You know, you can go into the classroom and you don't know what to expect, but doing things this way, it was just really super interesting to see what was going to evolve. Like, you can do that to an extent with papers and so forth, but to actually go out and facilitate a space where people are telling their stories on particular themes was very intriguing to me. So it was interesting to participate in that way. I don't know. That's sort of like an overall takeaway from that.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking about that, Sherry, I couldn't help but think, you know, but as academics, we are really bound to these structures, right? And even when we're setting, you know, learning objectives for our syllabus, and, you know, how the assignments are structured, and all of academia is really like that. But I felt very at ease with our process. And I think it's because I trusted it. You know, like that word of trust, like just really popped in my mind. And it's like, we had objectives. We knew what this course was about. And then leaving the space for the work to authentically connect to those objectives I think was what made it such a great process, so enjoyable. And it was so collaborative too, which is something that I really appreciated about this. Often, you know, when we're coming up with structures for teaching and learning, it's not as two directional, or in this case, 3-directional, which I really liked. I mean, I learned so much from Jessica. I learned so much from you, Sherry, and just to have this as a real co-learning experience created a lot of, I think it was decolonizing in a lot of ways, you know, how we were able to share that way. So those are my initial thoughts on how this worked.
That's a wonderful way to put it. Co-learning. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many key words in there, like co-learning, collaboration. But the basis of trust was so important, right? And taking the time to build that relationship between the three of us. And because the 3 interviews were built on trust that had been built through previous work as well. Yeah. And I've been thinking also about, you know, maybe we'll just jump to, in no particular order, one of the themes that emerged through the outset of this process was permanence and impermanence. I think early on we had been tackling, you know, trying to get this passed by a research ethics board of the university, and trying to be flexible, trying to be understanding that many of the outcome of the podcast was also to put it on the internet. And there's a certain sense of permanence in that, you know, having your voice, having your story being placed on the internet, and it could live forever. Anybody could record it and download it. But there's also the learning that I've been going through myself of the process and the content of impermanence, that there's an ability to do this through storytelling and not the written word, that is more fluid and allows for space to be created. And through that space, I think we've been able to let go of certain things so that new things can be brought in, new ideas, new structures, new processes. So I wonder, maybe starting with you, Melanie, if you have any comments on that and that impermanence, permanence, you know, duality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and it definitely tickles the postmodern part of my brain, you know, what, you know, the shades of gray and what's permanent and what's impermanent. And yeah, I mean, the podcast is permanent in a lot of ways. When you return to it, it will sound the same, it will be the same. But because it's a story, it's evolving, like all stories are evolving, right? It's not a way of transmitting knowledge that really is permanent. That's my understanding of the story anyway, is that it continues to change and be relevant to different contexts. So I think if we, you know, if your listeners in the future, you know, if 5 years from now somebody listens to these podcasts, they'll listen to it through, yeah, it'd be cool for sure. They'd listen to it, I think, through a lens of, that was 2020, you know, what was happening at that time, and how do those stories and those perspectives relate to that time, you know? And I, like when I listen to a podcast myself, or a radio show that might have been recorded in the past, I always kind of try and situate it in that way, if I can, if that information is available to me. So I think while it is permanent, it's not fully permanent, if that makes sense. It's still kind of iterative in a way.
Yeah, I agree, Melanie, when we think about this permanence and impermanence, and when I think about the stories themselves, and I was thinking about particularly John's, when he went back to history about the Berger report, and how he brought it all to, you know, 2020, and then left this big thing, open, and they all did that. All speakers did it, and then they leave this big thing open to the future. And I know Elder Albert really did that. And it's very interesting because when you look at those creation stories, and I think Janet spoke a little bit about this, you think about those creation stories, they're like, some of them are thousands of years old, and we're still learning from them. And so I think I agree, Melanie, in the sense that here you have these podcasts and so you've recorded them, but how are we going to listen to them? Mm-hmm. And I think you need to have a deep listening, because I'm quite sure I could probably go through those recordings again and still take another 10 pages of notes, because there's just so, and so it's interesting. I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like these are stories, and they speak to, yes, these were the stories that were recorded in 2020 and what was going on at that time. At the same token, there was just, it opened up so much possibilities that the teachings are not just stuck in 2020, if that makes sense. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me. Yeah. It's that time you're living in, right? And the lens that you come to the story with, and you'll always get different things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was John who talked about going into research. I guess we're just going to go with the flow here, but I loved it when he talked about how the conventional way of doing research was like by observing. And just by observing, you miss so many of the details. And even the stories he told himself, because I've heard about that report, I heard about the Mackenzie pipeline and so forth, and all of a sudden there's just so much. It's so much. There's so much enrichment because he brings sort of a backdrop to that otherwise you would never have received.
Yeah, I thought it was really important how he was highlighting how research was so instrumental, at that time, like instrumental in the sense that it was like a means to an end. It was like research done for this particular purpose, but not necessarily driven by community or, including stories at that time.
Consent was that set on a whirlwind that I'm going to be contemplating that, because consent is such a big issue today. But he was talking about throughout time, and Albert alluded to this too, where there was no consent. And I found their stories very parallel in that sense, in terms of missing the details, no consent, and to what decolonizing really, really means.
Yeah, for sure. There was one quote from John Bizot that just really, really stuck with me about research. And I hope I captured it word by word. I tried to anyway. We're passengers and they're bus drivers. The longer we're on the bus, the further we get away from home. That was so powerful. Just about the process of research and who's driving that bus, and for what reason and what direction is the bus going? Who's behind the steering wheel? I just find those metaphors to be really interesting.
Albert also, Cherry, you just talked about the similarities between the two, even though they didn't know each other and know of each other's stories. In terms of the direction that you just mentioned, Melanie, Albert really also spoke about the Western research, or the approach to research, being linear, whereas in his methodologies, he is often thinking circular. And so it's almost like it's okay if that bus comes back to the start and we revisit those creation stories over and over again. It reminds me a lot of one of your readings that you directed me to, Sean Wilson's Research is Ceremony book, where he talks a lot about the story being fine-tuned every time to the listener, and each listener needs a different element of that story. So what is the relevance? It's relevant to each of the listeners.
Yeah, and I think it has a little bit of play, because I noticed this was pretty rich in Janet's narrative in terms of adaptation. Because and you know, personally for me, I have such a political analysis of what adaptation means, and yet it kind of reminded me of another Indigenous person I know too, another Mi'kmaq. But what they were speaking about was, again, this impermanence theme in terms of that you evolve in those creation stories, but also you do adapt. You have to adapt. And there's some, you know, debate if climate change is going to be an opportunity, or is that going to be, catastrophic, let's so to speak. And it was really rich. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it, because as we know, Elder Albert speaks a lot about two-eyed seeing and how you take the best out of both worlds. And this has been like, we conceptualize this all the time, but I found Janet, just in her narrative, she was there. She was there. She was contextually there. And, of course, bringing up the mining, you know, how destructive this is. And this is, you know, where my own work is right at now, is these destructive, unsustainable practices. And yet, to point out the contradiction that we would not have been able to, the whole world right now would have not been able to keep up its communications the way that we are, in the manner that we are, without some of that mining. And that's really blew my mind. And I'm thinking, how do we do that? Maybe it's not so much mining, but how do we do that in a sustainable way and in a less destructive way? Anyways, to wrap up, I kind of got into the context of mining there, but just the two-eyed seeing concept and this whole thing of adaptation throughout time and trying to take the best of both worlds. And yet I could see Janet was there. She was there contextually trying to find, and she talks about balance and how do you balance that out. And it's an interesting it's an interesting thought, because I know as Indigenous people that we are always either we're too assimilated, not authentic enough, or we have to be stuck in time. But we're still very much alive and moving forward. We're still here after, I think, what did Albert say, 13,000 years, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you, Sherry. All podcasts were incredibly thought-provoking in different ways, but Janet's was thought-provoking in a very unique way. It's like she was grappling, and grappling in ways that I find myself grappling too, with like, what are the trade-offs? Like, here we are, we're doing this. We're able to talk to each other because of the technology and the resources that have been exploited. But then we had to trade something for that. And I'm not completely resolved within my own mind and heart about that, as much as I do appreciate what technology has given us. And we're going to continue to do that, right? We're going to keep adapting. And especially, with the current context that we're in now, like COVID-19, and I just see all of the personal protective equipment that people are wearing and all the resources that we're using to protect ourselves, and we have to, right? But that's a trade-off. Like we're having to exploit resources in a different way. And yeah, I don't want to go off on a tangent with it, but it was just that thought-provoking. It's a value question, I think, and it's not something that I have an answer to, that's for sure.
No, and this conversation is also about that grappling, that exploration. That's what I think that that's what you're hitting the nail on was for Janet, was part of this evolution of a discussion that she's having with herself, with her community. And I was so grateful for the opportunity to have it with her. And she did speak quite a lot about adaptation, and we focused on how she's being resilient and the resilience she's finding in her community. So I'm wondering if you each would be able to want to comment on this duality of resilience and adaptation, whether it's fluid or whether they're opposing. That resilience is sort of, it's what you talk about, Sherry. On one hand, you're expected as a nation to be sticking true to your original ways of being, but also to be adapting, to modernizing.
Well, I might as well just say the adaptation whole scenario really bothers me in the sense that the critical questions are not being asked of why are we having to adapt. And just to use climate change for an example, that here the whole world has taken on that responsibility. Each and every one of us, we know that we must not pollute, we must recycle, we must do this and we must do that. The issue that I have with it is that the critical analysis is saying, okay, why is climate changing? And we're led to believe that it's some natural occurrence without taking responsibility to how that it gets there. And I don't know if it was John and or Albert or both, but I think it was Albert talking about what's our responsibility. And so that kind of complicates in terms of adaptation and so forth. But then when you look through colonial history, is that we adapted. When foreigners came here, we adapted to this. We've adapted, and like I say, as a Mi'kmaq person, I'm a descendant, of the Mi'kmaq people, and that goes back 13,000 years. So obviously we're resilient and we adapt. And I think sometimes they're opposing, and I think sometimes they are fluid. When I think back when I went on a moose hunting trip, now I try to imagine that moose hunting trip without the four-wheelers, without the trucks to get up to that part and so forth. It's like, which is such a weird contradiction here. To go to particular lakes, we would have had to have the portages that, who was that? You do a lovely analysis of a teaching, I think, from John B., where you were you're canoeing, and the route, if you don't have the portages, you need the portages. Well, we used to do that in real life. And the irony of it is that the whole area where I was brought up like that, you have to carry the canoes and everything, they're all logging roads now, that we can get on our four-wheeler and we can go out to the lake. It's such a weird contradiction. And so I think there's times there's tensions, and I think there's times that it's fluid. I'm always amazed at my own people of how they've do some very probably ancient things, but in modern times, if that makes sense. Even when you bring those ceremonies forward, and then there's tensions because I think we're being forced to adapt. That it's almost a force of it's almost a form of oppression, but our resilience comes within the adaptation itself, in the sense that we refuse to be just victims. That we're going to do what we have to do. I don't know. That's a complicated. I'm sorry, I went on the tangent there. That's a complicated thing to think about. The contradiction between adapting and being able and resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess my perspective on it would come from the perspective of being like an educator and somebody who does community partnered research with Indigenous communities, and often it comes up that how I'll find language in a paper that's very much past tense. Indigenous people were, or historically did this, and I always find that interesting that traditional practices are not thought of in a contemporary context, and how those things come through, and how the relevance is still there, and sometimes students or industry partners won't understand that, that it's like certain things are relegated to the past, and that's not how things are now, rather than asking individuals and communities what's important to them, and how they express their indigeneity, and how that's never something that I could prescribe, or a government could prescribe, or anybody but the community or individual themselves, right? So I think just being really open-minded to understanding people's values, how their culture has evolved, contexts, I think it just requires a lot of sensitivity, in understanding how people see themselves, like how they self-identify, what adaptation means to them, what resilience means to them. I like resurgence, as a word, as a concept, because I think it helps people understand that that the context continuously shifts and evolves. And so if a culture is resurgent within that, it's going to look different, it's going to have a different kind of shape to it. And we're not here to impose our worldviews or what we imagine, somebody's culture looks like, but to be open to hearing what that looks like in a new context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love the idea of, and both of you do this so well, having been your student for some months now, ancient things in modern times, and that example of ceremony, and bringing that ceremony into the classroom, or bringing the classroom outside to be a part of ceremony where it's warranted, is exposing younger generations, students, those unfamiliar with the ceremony, in an appropriate way. And I think that that's been a big part of this learning, and this podcast is also being able to meet those I'm interviewing with at the appropriate ceremony. So, for example, I thought at the outset that this would potentially be a face-to-face conversation with at least Elder Albert Marshall here in Mi'kma'ki, but with the restrictions as they are today, and also just the pace of how things were flowing, it made more sense to do this over the internet. Because we're recording to post to the internet too. And Janet asked me specifically to make a water offering here in Mi'kma'ki. And it's a part of my, as I strive to do a daily meditation, often with water. But it's something that I specifically did on the day that I was speaking with Janet, because it's also in recognition that each person has their own request for ceremony and their own way of incorporating that ancient tradition into their lives today. So that was really a very interesting learning experience to go with the flow too. And it was also Elder Albert Marshall who spoke about responsibility and that balance of it's not just that we are, that he was adapting, that his nation was adapting, but that also he was trying to be an educator himself about responsibilities to ensure that the earth is not compromised, the ecological and cleansing capacity of the environment is sustained. And that duality of sustainability and responsibility, that they're never without each other, right? And that's something that I've been thinking about and trying to incorporate more into my understanding and work on sustainability, is that they require responsibilities too.
Yeah. And I mean, that when you were talking there, Jessica, I was just thinking about the circularity, right? And how we started about this podcast about talking about stories and their permanence and impermanence, right? And that's part of the adaptation and resilience too, is returning to those stories and revisiting them. in a different context. So it was just like a little circular thought for myself that came through.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if it's so much dualities or we're not recognizing the interrelatedness of things, and particularly living things. I was thinking of Janet when I don't have the quote right in front of me, but it was a powerful quote talking about water, that, we're inseparable from water. And that we can't be without water, and I've been thinking a lot about that, in the sense that it goes back to the sustainability and responsibility. It really brought home, people may think of this as a cliche, because I know Chief Seattle's speech has always been taken out of context, like how we are part of the web. Whatever you do to the web, you're doing to yourself. But that water was such a powerful example, because we cannot exist without it. It is fundamentally the part of life, and we cannot exist without it. And I was just, it just kind of made me think a little bit more about this whole thing. How do you be sustainable and how do you be responsible? And I'm not sure if that's a dual, if the both of them are just so intricately connected, because you cannot have sustainability. And I'm talking about, because I even know sustainability can be out of context. I'm not talking about sustainable in terms of financial stability, but the stability or the sustainability of life, that we are part of that life. And I think all three stories kind of spoke to this to a degree, that if you take on that responsibility for sustainability, you are regenerating life. And I know that Albert talks a lot about the 7 generations. And, I sit on committees and so forth where people are trying to debate how to integrate science, or, and so forth. Whereas these are just really simple concepts that I think can be applied in science and social science, in terms of, if you're not sustaining anything for 7 generations, well, then you still have more work to do on your responsibility. And we don't measure things that way in terms when it comes to impact assessment stuff. Okay, what's going to guarantee that this is going to be here for 7 generations? What are the the precautionary principles we can apply, or what can we, mitigation is such a big thing, and I hate that word because it always ends up to be a process for facilitating a project, as opposed to but really thinking in those concrete terms of sustainability for 7 generations. That's our responsibility. And I found it really interesting when Albert speaks about, he said it wasn't just as simple, I forget how he worded it, but it's not as simplified as we're thinking about it, in terms of, just taking the resource. I forget how he worded that. I'd have to go back to my notes, but how this does, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say, those stories were concrete enough for me that it really brought home the, sustainability, responsibility, and reciprocity, these are words that are touted quite a bit, particularly in academia, but you don't have the context behind them in the way that these 3 people spoke to it. John talked about credibility in research, and one of the fundamental problems about bringing credibility to Indigenous knowledge was about how he said it's because you're trying to, give it credibility through Western terms, and it doesn't really speak to the fluidity that we're speaking about, the impermanence of knowledge. And what I loved about a very humbling couple of statements that Albert had said, and this is a fundamental difference that goes against the grain of academia. He was saying, I'm just a conduit. He said, I'm a conduit. He said, I'm humble. That's all I have to offer. And I thought that was such a powerful thing to say, a provoking thing to think about in terms of that we run into ethics and into research, Indigenous knowledge. It becomes sometimes, well, most times it becomes just a toking thing. I shouldn't say toking. It becomes problematic where people don't know what to do with it half the time. Do we subsume it into these academic disciplines that come from the Western way of thought? Do they coexist? Or is there a way to bring those two worlds together? And I thought that was so powerful because he's saying, I'm sharing all this with you, but I'm only sharing it as a conduit of knowledge. I don't hold, although we say knowledge holders. So, it was just such a powerful thing. And he said, and that's all I have to offer, which is so counterintuitive to academic thinking, I thought.
Yeah, for sure. It is very counter to academic thinking, right? Because it's always about citing people and who said this, right? Who does the knowledge belong to? Finger quotes belong to, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just thinking when we were talking about Albert Marshall and how he was talking around 7 generations and thinking that far ahead. In my notes, I had down something else that was really thought-provoking to me that Albert said was that we need to learn what the natural world is saying.
Yeah.
And that just really makes me think about the relational aspect of all of this, relationship with the land and thinking 7 generations ahead, right? It goes back to that kind of permanence and permanence thing again in a way, right? Because if we stop listening, then what we heard, last year may not be the right thing for 7 generations ahead this year, right? So constantly maintaining that relationship and listening and adapting and changing. But a lot of systems don't work that way, right? Especially political systems are very short-sighted and aren't very relational. I find education systems are a little bit better, or can be. But yeah, the relational piece is something that I'm continuing to reflect on.
Yeah, and I think that's your impermanence because scientific fact and so forth, we have to we do build on them and it does evolve. What might have been the equation back 50 years ago is not the equation today, but I think that Melanie, you hit right on the head, is that you just have to keep listening, and it's ironic how you explain that. You keep listening to the earth, and it keeps evolving. And it keeps evolving, and it almost reminds me of the creation story itself. You keep listening, you keep listening, and you keep listening, and you put it, and it's very, very, very interesting. And poor Albert, he was trying to come to terms with, he looked at it, it sounded that he has all this knowledge, and when he was talking about being a conduit, he says he said one of his greatest handicaps was that he can't write in English, and of course English would be a second language to him as well, right? And I thought about that. It's there's a weird little contradiction in there, and then I was thinking that's why this space is so important. What Jessica had created this space that they didn't have to write. It was fluid. They went with the flow of those conversations, that they were able to tell those stories. And albeit he told them in English, but there was not that restriction as compared to, say, when we do a journal call and say, we'll put in your abstracts and so forth. And I found there was an impermanence around that. I don't know. I think my mind is still reeling. I have no really conclusions about those three stories. I will be thinking about those stories for a long time.
Yeah, it's a lot to reflect on, really. And as I'm speaking, I'm thinking, so I apologize if things don't come out fully formed or articulated, because it's just it's so much to digest. And I mean, I'll be thinking about this for a long time after this conversation still. I really appreciated how Elder Albert Marshall situated it in the times we're living in now too.
Yes.
And because, I mean, it's the elephant in the room, the huge elephant in the room, what this means for our connection to nature. And just something that I've been personally struggling with is my not being able to connect to nature, or maintain that relationship in the way that I have been in the past because of stay at home, and I know why I need to stay at home. But I think if we move forward during these times of pandemic, and if this is something that is a bit ongoing, we're going to have to think about how that relationship is going to change, or how it'll be maintained, and other things I don't have answers to, right? But something that's very much at the front of my mind these days, because I mean, pandemics don't come out of nowhere, right? This is very much an ecological thing. The earth is telling us something now, that we haven't been behaving properly. So how do we change our relationship? And so I really appreciated Albert bringing it back to that, and talking about how in the Mi'kmaq worldview, it's not about, the end of the world. The end of the world never comes, but it's about, people.
It's not in the language, he was
right.
saying.
Not in the language.
That's excellent, Melanie, when you're talking about the earth is speaking to us. And I think he was very much speaking to that. And I think Janet spoke to that as well. That, and it goes back to that theme you were talking about, listening. And the earth is speaking back to us. The world is speaking back to us. And this pandemic, Albert warns, like, we can either go back to the status quo, or do we change our relationship right here? And he said, if we're going back to the status quo, we might as well submit. That's basically what he was saying. And I love this idea of the land talking back to us, and it talks back to us in so many ways, whether it's via through climate change and so forth. And I know an elder here years ago when he was younger, and he had an elder teach him, like, when you can shake the fir tree and all this soot comes off of it, you don't see it. And there was talk about that too, what's invisible. And there's you don't see that soot, but what he was trying to demonstrate is that there's pollution in the air. It's very, very interesting. So there's ways that the land speaks back. And Albert was very poignant about that in terms of, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to listen this time? And and I think all of us have been going into these very thought-provoking stages through this COVID, and it will be really interesting when we come out of it, how we treat one another. How do, I'm hoping that we have a different relationship with the land and water, that we would never take that for granted again, but it's difficult to say. But I thought there was a big warning in that. He said, are we going to do something? Are we going to listen this time? And also he spoke to another contradiction again about technology. He was saying, like, we realize, like, Janet says, like, about the mining, here we have all this technology that allows us to communicate. But I loved how he said, for all the science and technology that we have, look what's happening. And he was speaking about the COVID. We can't seem to get a handle on this. And as far as I know, in the news, there's still not a handle on this. They don't know how, they're still, like, trying to figure this virus out. And with all the knowledge and the technology that we have in this world today, this virus has people stumped, and they're still struggling to try to figure out. Now, I don't know what's in the back rooms in terms of vaccines, or if we're close to that or not, but it's still something that they're still trying to find out. And I'm saying, wow, this is a real powerful virus to shut the world down. And that's basically what it did. More so in some areas than others, but I won't speak to our neighbors to the south. No. Anyways.
Yeah. I mean, like, the technological response to this, but even the policy response. And it just kind of reminds me of like responses of the past to things, you know. And so on some of the networks that I'm part of with IUCN, they're trying to come up with responses for this pandemic. And from certain groups that are more kind of like old school traditional conservationists, they're like,
yes,
we need to shut down all the wet markets, shut them down, you know, a big petition policy, sweeping policy to do that. But then people from my commission, which is more the socially focused one, are saying, wait, you know, these types of big sweeping responses in the past have actually really marginalized people, have infringed on their rights, especially Indigenous peoples. There's, you know, very little understanding of place-based connections to nature and food systems within a sweeping policy like that. You know, like we need to do this in a more respectful, participatory, collaborative kind of way, you know. But the instant reaction, I think, because everybody's going through pain with this, right? They're missing their families, loved ones are sick, that kind of thing, is to just be like big sweeping policy.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the right way.
No, I don't either. And Albert spoke to something that really speaks to me, because I think I'm kind of older than you two. When he was saying, like, he said, like, look how they're treating old people. Look at the prejudice that they have in treating old people. This, like, he called it prejudice, like ageism, you know. And I was thinking, oh my heavens, you know, for people that are on the verge of retirement, or they're thinking about their future, the worst thing, and particularly if you have children, is that you don't want to have your children like having to stop their, like, I'm talking about adult children. I can't think of my son and daughter having to stop their lives to, you know, to take care of me. So your obvious thing is, okay, go to a home if that's what it will. Well, I'm going to tell you, that whole theory, or that whole kind of planning, is just thrown right out the window with me right now. And I'm hoping that something comes concrete, that these beings, these actual human beings that have, you know, this pandemic, this virus, knows no age, but it seems like the elderly bore the brunt of that. And somehow we cast that off as, oh, well, they're old. You know, they've done their time. So that, yeah, I'm not saying it's more complicated than that, but that's how those mainstream policies seems to be speaking. Oh, we have to do something. We have to revive care. And I think they will. But I was thinking of all of these extraordinary human beings that have lived life, that were young like we were once, were younger, that, you know, lived these lives and had stories to tell. And somehow, because of their age, they don't have a value anymore. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. You provoked something in there, but I remember him talking about that, you know, are we going to carry on with this prejudice about old people? And I was just talking to a friend of mine that happened, like, going by my driveway the other day, and he stopped, and I told him, I said, you know, think of, because he has camps, and I said, turn those darn camps. So when us old people, I said, now I get it, because even though poverty was very much the way I was raised, in poverty and stuff, and I remember the old people living in these little tar paper shacks back in the woods and so forth, and I thought, wow, they had it. They were like off the grid, and
Yeah.
and as long as they could do it. I remember one old man that he died. There was just no way. We built him a house, we did everything, and there was just no way that he would convert. But anyways, that was just something else. Albert, you talk about that cycle of life, and yeah, and he was something about, he said, if you're full of prejudice, who's going to be looking after us when we get old? That was interesting. If you're full of prejudice, who's going to be looking after you when you get old? And anyways, I didn't mean to go on that edge. It just resonates with me quite a bit.
For sure.
Kind of
I think, yeah, I think older people and people with complex care needs are being treated differently amongst this pandemic. And it's it really, a lot of value questions have been coming up, just even watching how different countries, provinces open up at certain times and favor economy over life. And I came across this really interesting term from a friend who works in peace and conflict studies that I think it really describes this in so many other things, like necrocapitalism. It's like
what's called?
Necrocapitalism.
Okay.
So it's the acceptance of death for increase in economy. Which I think is just such a thought-provoking term, because you can see this relating to all kinds of systems, right? Not just this pandemic, but like food systems. And you look at like the man camps. We've talked about that in the past, Sherry, right? Like how missing and murdered Indigenous women are a part of that with this large-scale industrial development that brings a lot of men together. And so I just thought, sometimes the terms come up and they're like jargon and they're not that useful, but this one I think is very descriptive. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if there's probably a few more minutes left, where if there's any bits that you thought were very surprising to you. I know we've covered a lot in the last hour about elements that you saw coming together, and I've got one that I'll save to the end. But was there any particular aspect or theme from the podcast or the process, so content, message, medium, that you felt particularly relevant and drawn to?
Well, if I may, it's about the process itself. And what was so interesting about that, because we know like how we have to go through ethics and so forth, and if this had happened in person to person, would have it happened a different way? I think those are more questions for you, Jessica, than anything. But I was thinking, I think what Melanie was talking about, this element of trust. But there was a real strong element of trust, because I think these people and you worked with them in one way or another. But I thought it very interesting how, as having recorded interviews myself, and you're kind of nervous and you go through it, you get it done, you put that recorder down and so forth. Sometimes it's really difficult to invite people and that they feel comfortable. Now, all of three of them are quite familiar about the controversial things about being researched and about research, and the damage research can be done, because usually it skips over. It's like it's got an objective and it skips over all the details that are relevant to the community. And they gave a lot of great tips. I found a lot of good things about how you work with the community. You have consent, you have to have their stories and so forth. Anyways, it's kind of long-winded, but what really struck out to me was that how I don't know the work that went behind that. I have a pretty good idea. However, as that came out, how trusting they were to do this via technology, and to give you the rich data, as we would say in the research world, that they did. And it's something that I think we're going to have to revisit down the road, because they were just so powerful for those three. There's three interviews. It was just so powerful, so rich. And I think we can learn a lot about that in terms of Indigenous knowledge itself, but also that co-production of knowledge. And there's this thing that we do call participatory research to bring some real context to that as well, because as we know, even participatory research can go awry. And I don't know, there was just something about that whole thing of procedure-wise, the COVID kind of making it go this way, but I know you would have done those first two anyways because they lived away, but something so trusting that they just sat down and shared with us so many teachings. That
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I'm just saying. I think we do that in different ways, but this was really interesting because I've seen students struggle to get participants in their research, or they struggle because of that distrust, particularly with Indigenous people. What are you, they even question it sometimes. And this was just so done in a different spirit, I found, or I felt that.
I totally agree. Yeah. I think, it goes back to that fluidity that we were talking about, and just letting people speak, it's such a simple thing, but it's so powerful. And Jessica, you were so good at doing that, and I think that really put your interviewees at ease. I felt like they felt that they could talk about what was in their minds, and that you weren't rigidly directing them so much, that they could just really express themselves. And I think that's it's kind of an art and a skill. It's like, it's one of those things that's harder to teach, good listening and caring about what people say. But I think it's such a good example, that I want other students to hear your podcasts and to hear how you did it and how you treated people's knowledge. So was it surprising to me? No, it wasn't shocking or surprising, because I've gotten to know you, Jessica, and you're that type of sensitive person that you're very aware. But it was just really affirming of this type of approach and how valuable it can be, and that it's totally worth doing. Sometimes students are a little bit afraid of this type of process because there's so many unknowns or it's less structured, but somehow like a lot of richness and value comes out of that more open space, so I think it's just great. I'm really happy how it ended.
Thank you. Yes. Me too. I thank you, and I so appreciate your willingness to go on this experimental journey together. And I'm also very appreciative of all those who have gone before me, the willingness of especially the elders, Albert Marshall and John Bizot, who have worked with researchers and had a good relationship. So we're willing to work with researchers again in this context. And then for Janet, she's also forging her own relationships with academia. So her willingness to experiment in this sense is her side of things, to see if she can push some boundaries in her own work and her own research, and possibly coming, here to Halifax and seeing how that. So I surprised myself in some senses, just letting go of needing to have control over certain situations, timing, questions, answers, whatever, and seeing the magic of what came out of that. And the other thing that really surprised me was this common dialogue and motivation, value of love of life, love of beings, love of the Mother Earth. And I was quite surprised because I had approached decolonizing research from perhaps a more academic, theoretical perspective, and a lot of the writing is about stemming from violence. A lot of academic writing, and it also can stem from love. And that was so surprising, that was where our conversations went, not in the direction of violence, but actually in the direction of love as a motivation. And if we're motivated by love, then we can find true answers and transformation in, all the problems that you've just discussed in terms of neglect, in terms of necro-capitalism, in terms of how we treat our previous generations, our older generations, and our future generations. So I hope through recording stories that we are creating a venue where these stories can be revisited and re-listened to and bring new teachings for people in the future. And perhaps that's, teaching ourselves about this methodology. That's the first thing. Well, this chapter closed. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Okay. Well, we'll talk again later.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.
And that concludes the 4th episode of our podcast series, Storytelling, Story Listening. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have any comments or just want to reach out and chat about this podcast and the process, please reach out. My contact information is in the show notes. Thanks so much for your time, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.